Hey guys, it's David from Hoop Southbound, throwing out some late night bonus coverage for you guys, just like we did in March Madness. Of course, tonight was the NBA lottery, and we found out who the first 14 picks were going to be, or who was going to make the first 14 picks in this year's draft. So I sat down, took a couple of notes that I've been thinking about for a while on the board, and kind of put some stuff together. And this is where I think we're at currently with the NBA draft and where I expect players to be taken. Now, obviously, always kind of take this in just a small portion here. We still don't know the combine results or some of the scout notes or what's going to be said on one side or the other. Also, my board here, or my mock draft, so to speak, did not necessarily take into account trades. So this was based more on position needs and what I think they would do if a team did not trade. So there's a lot of things in here that have a little bit of nuance to them. So take that in consideration. I will mention that if I think there is a spot where I think that a trade is likely or very possible. So let's go through what we've got going down here. Obviously, the big news is that San Antonio getting the number 1 overall pick, and that's where they're taking Victor W at. And that's what I've got in my first pick. That's what ESPN was talking about. That's what we've all been talking about as the number 1 pick for a while. Big man, great basketball player, knows exactly what he needs. For San Antonio getting this pick, it's kind of funny that them getting this number 1 pick and a big man being on the board, just the exact same way, with Tim Duncan, generational talent, big, come to San Antonio. The history repeats itself once again. I like this quite a bit. It also matches up with San Antonio's need because, well, they have a critical need for everything. When you look at their team needs right now, San Antonio, desperate need for a center. Victor being a center, this is a natural fit. He's already talked about being the number 1, but if you did look specifically on their roster needs, everything right now is in a severe or critical category. When you look at different draft breakdowns, the only position they're really good at is small forward. So this is obviously a good pick for them. The highest taken center in this draft and the number 1 over draft pick is going to be Vic. All right. So let's go to the number 2 pick here, and that is the Charlotte Hornets. This one I had to do a little debate on because this is where things kind of get a little complicated. Now, I said earlier that when I wrote these down, I wasn't taking trades necessarily in immediate consideration. 2 and 3 are picks that I think could be traded and change up the position entirely. But for right now, what I've got for the Charlotte Hornets is Scoot Henderson being the number 2 pick. Charlotte has a need for a point guard. Most other teams have a setup on 2 good points. And I know Charlotte's already set up with a good one and they're involved, but most good teams will have that backup point guard, or they'll have another point guard in good consideration. Scoot Henderson being the number 1 point guard on this board made logical sense. Brandon Miller, I know I said on an earlier show, made sense to me as the number 2 pick, but that was without Charlotte getting that pick. And I said also in that show, it just depends. It depends on team needs. Charlotte's not in desperate need for a small forward. I know there's a lot of talk about positionless basketball, but for me overall, what I see Charlotte needing the most and what's available at this time given in the draft is a point guard. They're at a low need for anybody in a forward position, small forward or power forward, but they have a need for a center and a point guard. So I like Scoot Henderson here. It makes sense. It's also possible that Charlotte trades this pick and gives it to someone like Houston, is who I think might be the possibility, or someone like the Raptors. So we'll have to see. Raptors going to be a big talking point. They're a team that could probably move up in a lot of cases throughout this. But right now, if Charlotte were to make this pick, I think they're taking Scoot Henderson, going out there and playing for Michael Jordan and his crew. The number 3 pick, I have Brandon Miller to the Portland Trail Blazers. Not really a critical need at all for a small forward, but I think this is where talent wins out. When you make this pick, it's a little bit more, he's there, why not make it? There's a slight need for a small forward. So I've got Portland doing this. Now, I do think that there's quite the consideration for a trade here. Again, Houston's possibility for that. They need a small forward. Then you're looking at Orlando might need a need for a small forward. There's also teams way back when you start looking at the 11 through 14 picks. teams that might be more interested, like the OKC Thunder or the Toronto Raptors, who I mentioned a little while ago. Those are teams that I think would be in consideration for making a trade with Portland here. So don't be surprised if Brandon Miller ends up in Toronto. That would be my guess if Portland doesn't take him for himself. But this is a pretty talented player when you talk about Brandon Miller. Obviously, he was with one of the best players in the conference. He was the best player in the conference, SEC Player of the Year, one of the best players in college basketball. Definitely makes sense to take Brandon Miller here. Horrific score. It's a good choice if you're just going to be forced to make a pick. So Portland, I have taken Brandon Miller, but don't be surprised if you see a trade in this situation. For Houston, obviously, I think that's the team that needed Brandon Miller the most. And it's just unfortunate that they're one spot back to where they can actually get that one. It would have been a perfect situation because Houston has a need for a small forward. So I think they're going to grab the next best available one here, and that's going to be Amen Thompson. That's who I have right now from Overtime Elite, and that's where I think Houston goes to unless they do make that trade saying that, no, we need someone right now, because there's a lot of pressure on Houston to make this move. So I can see them taking Amen Thompson or trading up possibly for one pick if that makes sense to them, because there's enough pressure on the organization. But if things held, I'm thinking Amen Thompson. For Detroit, I'm thinking Walker out of Houston here. Now, I know he's not necessarily the star-studded talent the Pistons are going to be looking for. Obviously, they were probably more interested in Brandon Miller, but there is a need for a power forward for Detroit. And while Walker's slightly undersized, he's very experienced. He's a good basketball player. He's got a lot of the fundamentals down. He's a much more complete basketball player. So Detroit, it would make sense here in my mind for them to take Walker out of Houston. Let's move on to pick 6, and this is where things kind of get a little complicated. I think I've got, honestly, the players from 6 to 10 pretty much correct. I think the order is what's chaotic, is trying to figure out where these guys are going to go, because if you were looking at mock boards before, or mock drafts and boards before the Combine and before the Lotto tonight, these players are pretty much all being mentioned through that 6 through 10 range. It's just now a matter of figuring out who's going to take where, who feels that this need is more important than this need, and it becomes a little bit more chaotic because this has got really well shuffled compared to what the original thoughts were. But I have the other Thompson twin being taken. There is a need for a small forward for Orlando, and a big portion of what Orlando's trying to do right now is that they need guys who can drive the basketball. They need small forwards. They need wings. They need guys who can get in, cut defenses up, and I like the other Thompson twin, Azar, here to get the job done. Number 7, this just feels a little too high for Anthony Black for me, but he is my number 2 point guard on my board, so it makes sense, and it's not too far off from where I had thought that Anthony Black was going to be taken. I was thinking he was going to be taken 8 through 10. 7's just one spot higher. So I think the Pacers might reach here for their need for a point guard. I like them taking Anthony Black here. It makes sense to me. Large point guard, get the job done. He would probably make more sense for Washington because they need someone who's a physical point guard like Anthony Black. But Indiana, it makes a lot of sense because they do have the need for a point guard as well. So I do look at Indiana and I say that point guard spot can be filled by Anthony Black. I think this would be the highest that Anthony Black would be taken. It's unfortunate that a Razorback doesn't fall to my Dallas Mavericks, but we'll get there in a little bit. All right, so for Washington, obviously they're also in need of a point guard. This is a team that's had issues at the point guard spot for a while. I have Casey Wallace here as my next best available point guard. There's a need for point guards for out of these next 6 picks through 6 through 11, with Orlando being on the tail end. Everybody needs a point guard except the Dallas Mavericks. And then New Orleans is also going to be looking for a point guard as well. So it's just kind of what it is. It's kind of figuring out who likes who's going to end up becoming the best looking out of the Combine. But right now I've got Casey Wallace as my number 3 point guard, and that's who I've got Washington taking to fill that need. They also have a need for a center, but I just don't like putting a big in this situation. There is a possibility that they do take someone like Taylor Hendricks if the board falls out this way, or them trading to try to figure out their situation later. But I don't think necessarily Washington's in a position they want to trade. All right, so Utah, there's some different situations here. I think there's a possibility for a lot of players going to Utah. There's a good case for them in a lot of ways. And I don't have a direct fit here because the biggest need in Utah, like I've mentioned in this section of the draft, is a point guard. there's not a point guard that I think that you would necessarily go on at the 9th pick here. So Grady Dick is a pretty good scoring option from the outside. If Utah doesn't trade this pick, I think Grady Dick would make logical sense for them to take someone who's got a scoring ability here. So I'm liking the Grady Dick option. It wouldn't surprise me if Grady Dick falls further in the draft, but somewhere around 9 through the 14 pick would make sense to me on Grady Dick. He is a piece that you can add in for a team that needs a little bit more scoring. So I do like Grady Dick's option as a fill-in piece here if Utah did not trade this pick. My number 10 pick, my team, the Dallas Mavericks, I've got them taking Taylor Hendricks. There's a need for a center in Dallas, but the bigger need is defense, and Taylor Hendricks provides that defense. He's a really good pick, really good defensive player, brings a lot of size to the floor for the Dallas Mavericks. Scoring is not necessarily the problem. Offense isn't necessarily the issue for the Mavericks, but I think Taylor Hendricks is an option. Now, if Taylor Hendricks is not here, I have seen a couple of different options on different boards and different ideas about this spot. The two that I've seen so far have been, and I would love this one, Nick Smith Jr. going to the Dallas Mavericks as a possibility. I think that's a little high for Nick Smith Jr., given the situation with everything, but with the questions of injuries right now. But not necessarily. The option that I think would be more likely if Taylor Hendricks isn't available here is Dallas trading this pick. It's a possibility, but they do have the pick. So if Taylor Hendricks is available, I think that's who they take. But there's a lot of pressure on Dallas right now to do something, and that it would make sense for them to try to take a score. So I think that's maybe like a 30% chance if Taylor Hendricks isn't available, them taking Nick Smith Jr. But we'll have to see. I'd love that as a Mavs fan. So if you're listening to me, Mark Cuban, that would be the pick I would desire. But Taylor Hendricks makes sense to me here, and that's who I've got written down. All right, let's go to the back portion here. We've got, I know this is a player that a lot of people have written higher, but I just don't see necessarily the superstar. I will say with this 11 pick to the Orlando Magic, Cam Whitmore, if he doesn't go here, just go ahead and flip it back to 6 and go ahead and see Cam Whitmore going to Orlando at 6. And then Azor Thompson, just take your place and everything changes up entirely. And so we may see Anthony Black falling back to 8 to Washington like we suspected, but it's all about where kind of Cam fits into this equation. I personally think that we may see him fall. That's just a guess. I don't see the superstar talent that everyone else has been talking about. He's a very good basketball player, but I don't think he's going to be an all-time NBA great like some people have suggested. I think he's going to be a very good basketball player, and he's definitely worthy of being a lottery pick. But I don't think that he's anywhere in the field of some of the all-time Hall of Famers. Cam Whitmore, to me, falls more in this range. It would make sense to me for seeing him going around this 11 spot. Additionally, there is a need, like I said, for Orlando for that small forward position. If he's available here, I could see Orlando taking this move. So it would make sense to me. He fills a team need. He's a big, small forward. I like the idea here. He's a talented basketball player, and he would actually be a really good pick here if he should fall this far back. Number 12, I've got Nick Smith Jr. Going to the OKC Thunder. There are too many Razorbacks on the OKC Thunder if this were to happen, but they do have a need for a shot guard. Nick Smith Jr. fills that role. This seems like an appropriate place for Nick Smith Jr. And with the questions of injuries, you have other players on OKC that could fill if there were, Nick Smith needing to sit out for the first couple of weeks or to put him in the G League for a little while. There's options for OKC because they got a very deep roster. Another name, though, that I've seen for the possibility here at 12 for OKC is Leonard Miller, who is a very good player out of the G League. There was some concern with him, but there's been a little bit of thought that's been growing with the way that Miller ended his season with that 29 point and 14 rebound game in the G League. He's been getting more talk, but I haven't seen him necessarily this high to this point. So I think it's definitely a possibility that Nick Smith Jr. ends up here, but don't put it out of your mind that if Leonard Miller comes out and has a really good, period between now and the draft and teams take more notice, it could break the board. I've seen that, but I think Nick Smith Jr. makes more sense here than anybody else. Pick 13. I think Toronto might trade up at some point, but if they did not, what they also need besides a point guard is a shot guard. Keontae George here makes sense to me. He's probably the most controversial player in the draft on where his position is, but I seen Keontae George play, and I think that there's going to be some scouts who feel certain ways that he's better than what he might be being advertised. I personally like Keontae George as someone going a little bit higher in the draft. It feels like a borderline lottery pick or not. So could he go here? This makes sense to me, but I don't know if Toronto is going to be picking 13. So I've got Keontae George right now for 13, but I also see this as a possible situation where another team might be sitting in this spot when it comes around. So don't double down on this or anything like that. But I do like Keontae George as an option here as a shot guard for Toronto, especially if Nick Smith Jr. is gone or Toronto doesn't move up. All right, so my final situation here with New Orleans Pelicans, there's a lot of players that I have seen in this 14 spot, but I've gone to fill a team need with New Orleans. They do need a point guard, so I've gone with Jalen Hood-Schifino out of Indiana. There's a lot of players I've seen mentioned in this spot like crazy, several different players. This is kind of wild right now. I've seen Jet Howard. I've seen other guys' names pop up in there. So right now, this is a wild card position to me. I'm not sure what New Orleans is thinking, but this fills a team need. This is my best point guard available after you go through all this process. So I do think that Jalen Hood makes sense coming into this portion of the draft. All right, so those are my initial reactions to the lottery tonight. Obviously, some heartbreaking deals for a lot of teams, a lot of fan bases out there. You certainly wish that if you're, say, a Rockets fan or a Pistons fan, especially, that you ended up somewhere in those top 3 picks. Unfortunately, that's just not how it worked out tonight. But for the Spurs, if you're a fan in San Antonio, it's been a really good night for you. So get a talented big man and everything else. All right, so we've got more coverage on the NBA draft. We're going to be doing deeper dive looks. This is just an initial reaction that I had, but we're going to be doing more looks on the show throughout the time now, all the way to the NBA draft. And then me and Maddie will be reacting to the draft after that's complete. So we're going to have more coverage on this. We'll have some more reactions to the combine that's going to be going on today and then the rest of the week. So we'll see how players shake out. I'm very interested. Maddie is talking about, we talked about on this show, Jordan Walsh is a player to watch right now in the NBA combine. And we're going to see him play some games, some scrimmage games there at the combine. So it'll be very interesting. We'll keep an eye on him. Player I've been keeping my eye on personally is G.G. Jackson. Unfortunately, he's not going to be in the scrimmage games for us, but I'll be interested to see how the scouts have talked about him and where they think he's going to end up. There's a lot of spots. Like I said, I think G.G. Jackson could end up as high as a lottery pick, or it can end up in the low 20s. There's a wide range on where he can end up. So he's a player to pay attention to throughout the course of this week and the days leading up to the draft. All right, we will be back next time. We're going to have a quick word from our sponsors, but hang around. We're going to have more coverage coming up through on next Tuesday following the NBA draft. So I'll catch you guys next time.
All right, so I'm a baseball guy, and my goal is to actually see a game in every Major League Baseball stadium. Now, I'm more than a third of the way there, and I never buy from the team's websites. SeatGeek is my first stop whenever I'm heading to a new city for a ball game. Now, obviously, they've got some other sports, as well as concert tickets, Broadway, comedy, I mean, you name it. And now, for BSN listeners, they're actually offering you $20 off your first ticket purchase. So just use the code BSN, that stands for Variety Sports Network. So that's BSN to save $20. So put that to use for some food or for some drinks at whatever event you are wanting to attend. Again, that code is BSN to save